The sirens were blaring across the southern border checkpoint as 400 of our freight trucks were instantly impounded by federal agents. My phone vibrated with 80 missed calls from the new executive vice president. I just took a long, slow sip of my dark roast coffee, feeling the warm morning breeze against my face. Backing up 18 years, let me tell you exactly how it all started and how a single arrogant decision unraveled an entire corporate empire. I am Marshall Grant. I am 58 years old, and until very recently, I was the executive director of cross-border operations for Caldwell Freight. We were an absolute titan in the supply chain sector, moving over $250 million worth of commercial freight, raw industrial materials, and high-risk, hazardous cargo across the southern border every single year. My job was the nerve center of the entire enterprise. When you are dealing with hazardous material manifests, double axle weight regulations, and the relentless scrutiny of customs and border protection, there is absolutely zero margin for error. A single misplaced decimal point or an unauthorized route could trigger a massive federal lockdown. Caldwell Freight was built from the ground up by Howard Caldwell. Howard was a grizzled, old-school freight veteran who understood that in the complex world of logistics, trust and legal compliance were your actual currencies. When I joined his company 18 years ago, we only had 40 trucks. We were barely scraping by, competing fiercely with mega carriers who possessed seemingly infinite corporate resources. Howard brought me in because I knew the federal customs matrix better than anyone else on the market. I spent my 20s and 30s working directly alongside border compliance agencies, learning the exact intricacies of the federal regulatory framework. I was intimately familiar with the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, a rigorous federal program that is essentially a VIP fast pass for freight. If you have that certification, your trucks cross the international border in minutes. If you do not have it, your trailers get unpacked, inspected piece by piece, and delayed for days, bleeding cash by the hour and destroying customer trust. Howard and I worked side by side for nearly 2 decades. I handled the grueling government audits, the complex continuous transit bonds, and the highly classified hazardous material security plans. We grew the fleet from 40 modest rigs to 400 massive, state-of-the-art vehicles. We secured lucrative, long-term contracts with the largest chemical battery manufacturers in the hemisphere. Our corporate valuations skyrocketed. We were clearing $20 million in annual recurring revenue just from our specialized chemical transport division alone. We were completely unstoppable, a well-oiled machine operating at peak efficiency. But 9 years ago, we hit a massive administrative roadblock that almost brought the entire company to its knees. During a highly complex corporate restructuring designed to separate our primary assets from a liability lawsuit involving a third-party subcontractor, the company temporarily lost its standing to hold the primary federal transit bond. We suddenly had 60 trucks loaded with highly volatile lithium-ion batteries sitting at the border, burning thousands of dollars in late delivery penalties every single day. Howard was in an absolute panic. He called me into his office at 2 in the morning, pacing the floor, looking like he was about to have a massive heart attack. The corporate lawyers were telling him it would take 6 months to get the corporate entity recertified for the hazardous bond. We did not have 6 months. We did not even have 6 days before we would lose our primary contract and face bankruptcy. I had a solution, but it was incredibly unorthodox. I owned a small personal holding company, Grant Compliance Limited Liability Company, which I had maintained strictly for independent consulting work before I joined Caldwell Freight full-time. My personal company already had pristine federal standing and possessed the exact clearance tier required to hold a continuous customs bond for hazardous materials under Title 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 1114. I presented the paperwork to Howard, explaining that I could underwrite the transit bond through my personal company. I could lease my certification to the fleet as a designated third-party compliance operator. The federal system allowed it, provided I remained the named director of operations. However, it meant the federal government would view me personally as the absolute guarantor of his entire cross-border fleet. He did not even hesitate. He signed the operational transfer right then and there in the middle of the night. From that moment forward, Caldwell Freight operated its most profitable division entirely under the legal umbrella of grant compliance. I held the keys to the kingdom. My name was on every manifest, every border pass, every hazardous transit permit. Over the years, that temporary fix just became the permanent foundation. The corporate lawyers forgot about it. The accounting department just saw it as a standard operational expense. We were making too much money for anyone to care about the structural anomaly. Everything was perfect until Howard suffered a severe stroke last year. He survived, but he was forced into immediate medical retirement. He handed the keys to the entire empire to his 32-year-old son, Lance Caldwell. Lance was the exact opposite of his father. He had never driven a truck, never stood on a loading dock at 4 in the morning, and never negotiated with a hostile customs agent in the freezing rain. He went to a prestigious private business school, wore impeccably tailored Italian suits, and spoke entirely in empty corporate jargon. To him, the 400 veteran drivers keeping the company alive were just meaningless numbers on a spreadsheet that needed to be aggressively optimized. When he took over, as executive vice president of operations, the entire culture of the company shifted overnight. He immediately brought in a team of fresh-faced management consultants who knew absolutely nothing about freight logistics, but knew everything about cutting corners to boost short-term profit margins. He did not see me as the architect of his father's success. He saw me as an obsolete, overpaid fossil who did not fit his sleek, modern corporate vision, and I was about to find out exactly how incredibly arrogant he could be. Lance wasted absolutely no time, tearing down everything his father and I had meticulously built over the past 18 years. Within his first 3 months in charge, he slashed the critical maintenance budget for the fleet by 30%. He replaced our veteran dispatchers with a cheap automated routing software that constantly crashed, and he instituted a draconian penalty system for our most reliable drivers. Company morale plummeted to an all-time low. We lost 30 of our absolute best drivers in a single month. But because the overall payroll expenses temporarily dropped, Lance looked like a financial genius to the board of directors. He was parading around the executive office like he had single-handedly invented the concept of modern logistics. I tried repeatedly to warn him. I walked into his massive glass-walled corner office on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a thick stack of delayed shipment reports. He was practicing his golf putt on an expensive artificial turf mat, not even bothering to look up when I entered the room. I told him we needed to talk about the automated routing system immediately. I dropped the heavy reports on his pristine mahogany desk. The software was forcing the hazardous material trucks onto secondary highways that were not cleared for chemical transport. We were risking massive federal fines. The drivers were exhausted, and the customs officers were starting to flag our manifests because the arrival times had become completely erratic. Lance finally looked up, leaning on his shiny putter with a deeply condescending smirk. He told me I was missing the big picture, claiming the software reduced idle fuel consumption by 12%. He said they were modernizing, and I needed to stop living in the past with his father's outdated methods. I kept my voice perfectly level and countered that his father's methods ensured we did not get our federal licenses revoked. I explained that you cannot optimize compliance because it is strictly binary. You either follow the federal code exactly, or they shut you down completely. I warned him that if a truck carrying industrial lithium batteries got flagged on an unauthorized route, the Environmental Protection Agency and Customs would freeze the entire fleet without hesitation. He just rolled his eyes, tossing the putter aside and sitting down behind his massive desk. He intertwined his fingers, looking at me like I was a stubborn child who could not understand simple math. He told me he appreciated what I did for his dad when the company was basically a small-time operation, but they were scaling up. He revealed they were preparing for a massive $90 million acquisition deal next quarter. The corporate buyers wanted to see streamlined operations, not a bloated payroll and a director of operations who thought he was untouchable just because he had been there for 18 years. I knew exactly what he was doing at that very moment. He was actively building a paper trail to terminate me. My annual salary and my performance bonuses were significant. If he could eliminate my position entirely and distribute my critical responsibilities among 3 junior managers making entry-level wages, he could artificially inflate the quarterly earnings right before the major acquisition. He genuinely thought I was just an expensive middle manager. He had absolutely no idea that the entire legal architecture of his massive cross-border fleet was resting entirely on my shoulders. The absolute climax arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I was in the middle of coordinating a massive, time-sensitive shipment of medical-grade batteries destined for a hospital network. It was a crucial contract that required absolute precision. My desk phone rang abruptly. It was Lance's assistant coldly informing me that my presence was required in the main executive conference room immediately. When I walked in, Lance was sitting comfortably at the head of the long oak table. Next to him was a ruthless, slick-haired corporate attorney named Donovan. Donovan was a highly paid shark Lance had brought in specifically to handle the upcoming corporate restructuring. There was a single manila folder sitting ominously on the table. Lance told me to take a seat. He was not smirking anymore. He was trying hard to project an aura of absolute authority. I remained standing, crossing my arms, and told him to make it quick because I had trucks hitting the border in 20 minutes. The lawyer Donovan opened the folder. He spoke in a cold, practiced tone, stating that as part of their ongoing operational restructuring, the company had decided to move in a different direction. Effective immediately, my position as Executive Director of Cross-Border Operations was being eliminated. My access to the corporate network had already been entirely revoked. Security would escort me to my office to pack my personal belongings. I looked at Lance. He was leaning back in his expensive ergonomic chair, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. I asked them, keeping my tone completely neutral, who was going to manage the continuous transit audits and who was handling the hazardous material manifests. Lance replied smoothly that they had transitioned those administrative tasks to the new software system overseen by his new logistics team. He called me obsolete and said the industry had moved past me. I asked about my severance package, knowing exactly what was coming. Lance chuckled a dry, incredibly arrogant sound. He told me there would be no severance. He claimed I was being terminated for cause, specifically insubordination and failure to adapt to new corporate protocols. He accused me of being hostile to the new management structure since day one. He said they owed me absolutely nothing and that I should be thanking him that he was not pursuing legal action for the revenue they allegedly lost due to my archaic methods. It was a blatant, highly calculated lie. They were firing me to save my $250,000 salary and my pending $5 million performance bonus. They wanted a perfectly clean balance sheet for their upcoming $90 million acquisition, and I was the biggest expense on the ledger. Donovan pushed a piece of paper across the table. He told me to sign the non-disclosure and non-compete agreement, and they would allow me to keep my company vehicle for another 30 days. If I refused, security would walk me out right that second. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Lance. He was practically vibrating with smug superiority. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered a veteran player. He thought he had won the game. I told him quietly that I would not be signing anything. Lance's smirk widened into a full grin. He said he thought I might say that, and then he told me I was fired and to go clear my desk. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum or demand to speak to his sick father. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out of the conference room. I went straight to my office, packed 18 years of my professional life into a single cardboard box, and walked out to my car under the watchful eye of a security guard. As I drove out of the corporate parking lot, I felt a strange sense of absolute calm wash over me. Lance thought he had just optimized his payroll. He did not realize he had just pulled the pin on a massive federal grenade. I drove straight home, the afternoon sun beating down on the windshield. My phone was completely silent. They had already cut my access to the corporate email servers, the dispatch logs, and the driver communication network. I was completely locked out of Caldwell Freight, but that did not matter in the slightest. The only system that actually mattered was not hosted on their corporate servers. It was hosted on mine. I walked into my home office, set my cardboard box on the floor, and booted up my personal, heavily encrypted workstation. I did not need their corporate network. I needed the federal portal. I navigated to the highly secure login page for the United States Customs and Border Protection Automated Broker interface. I inserted my physical hardware security token, typed in my complex credentials, and watched the main dashboard load. There it was, Grant Compliance Limited Liability Company. Under my personal company's dashboard sat the active continuous transit bond and the primary clearance certification that provided absolute legal authority for 400 Caldwell freight trucks. Every single vehicle identification number, every driver profile, and every hazardous material manifest was legally tethered exclusively to my personal company. According to the federal government, Caldwell Freight did not have the authority to move a single lithium battery across the border. Grant Compliance did. Caldwell Freight was just a designated subcarrier operating strictly under my explicit voluntary legal umbrella. Lance's shiny new management team, his expensive lawyers, and his automated routing software were all completely blind to this massive reality. During the due diligence for his upcoming $90 million corporate acquisition, they had only looked at the surface-level operational expenses. They saw that the customs fees were being paid on time. They never bothered to check whose name was actually on the federal guarantor documents. They simply assumed it was a standard corporate asset. It was late Thursday afternoon. I poured myself a glass of aged bourbon, sat back in my comfortable leather chair, and went to work. Under Title 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 1114, a principal bondholder has the absolute right to terminate a designated subcarrier's operating privileges at any time, for any reason, without prior notice, if they believe the subcarrier can no longer ensure the absolute security of the hazardous cargo. By firing the only qualified compliance officer, which was me, Caldwell Freight was now officially operating completely unguided. I clicked on the Subcarrier Management tab. I selected the entire fleet profile for Caldwell Freight. 400 active trucks, $250 million in annual freight. I hovered my mouse over the Revoke Association button and clicked it. The system prompted me for a secondary confirmation, warning that severing this association would immediately invalidate all active transit manifests and border crossing clearances for the selected subcarrier, and that vehicles currently in transit might be subject to immediate federal impoundment. I took a slow sip of my bourbon. I typed my secure digital signature. I clicked confirm. In less than 3 seconds, the massive federal database updated. The kill switch was officially activated. The clearance was instantly dissolved. The continuous transit bond for hazardous materials was completely voided. Caldwell Freight was now a massive, heavily loaded freight company operating entirely without federal authorization. But I was not done yet. If I just left it at that, the trucks would simply get turned around at the border, causing a major delay, but perhaps something Lance could eventually untangle with enough expensive lawyers and a few weeks of downtime. I wanted maximum, catastrophic impact. I wanted the kind of absolute chaos that makes a corporate board of directors demand an immediate resignation. I drafted a formal, legally bulletproof notification to the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation. I informed them that as the primary guarantor, I had severed all ties with Caldwell Freight due to critical management restructuring that compromised the secure transport of hazardous materials. I cited my own termination as the primary evidence that the company no longer possessed a qualified compliance officer on staff. When you tell the federal government that 400 trucks carrying volatile chemical batteries are currently rolling toward an international border without proper oversight or legal bonding, they do not send a polite email. They initiate a full-scale lockdown. They flag every single license plate, every driver identification, and every corporate tax number associated with the company. I hit send on the notification. The massive federal bureaucracy would take the entire weekend to process the severity of the alert. The real impact would not hit until the massive Monday morning freight surge. I closed my laptop, finished my drink, and went out to my backyard to grill a steak. For the first time in 18 years, I was not stressed about dispatch logs, driver fatigue, or customs audits. I slept perfectly that entire weekend. Monday morning arrived. I woke up at my usual early hour out of pure habit. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, walked out to my front porch, and watched the sun come up. At exactly 6:45, the first massive wave of Caldwell freight trucks would be hitting the primary commercial inspection lanes at the southern border checkpoint. I checked my watch. 10 minutes later, my phone, which had been silent for 3 days, suddenly lit up on the kitchen counter. It was an unknown number. I ignored it. Seconds later, it rang again, then again. Within a few minutes, I had over a dozen missed calls. My inbox was soon flooded with urgent, high-priority automated alerts from the Caldwell Freight dispatch system, which they had apparently forgotten to fully disconnect from my secondary email address. The chaos had officially begun. The trap was fully sprung, and I had the best seat in the house. The voicemails were stacking up, forming a beautiful symphony of escalating corporate panic. I finally decided to listen to the first one. It was Lance's assistant, her voice trembling in absolute fear. She begged me to call them back immediately, claiming there was a massive system glitch at the border. None of the trucks were clearing, and Customs was demanding to speak with me personally. I deleted the message. The next one was from Donovan, the slick corporate lawyer. He did not sound arrogant anymore. He sounded completely breathless and terrified. He said they had an emergency situation. The federal system was showing their fleet as unauthorized, and the Border Patrol was threatening to impound the vehicles. He demanded my login credentials to the Customs portal, claiming it was a direct order from the executive board. I laughed out loud. A direct order? I did not work for them anymore. I deleted that message too. By 9 in the morning, the situation had escalated from a delay to a full-blown federal incident. I turned on the local news channel. There was a helicopter shot of the southern border checkpoint. A massive, miles-long traffic jam of freight trucks was backing up onto the interstate. Right at the front of the line, clearly visible in high definition, were dozens of Caldwell freight trailers. They were not just being turned around, they were being actively cordoned off by armed federal agents. When a company attempts to cross an international border with hazardous materials without a valid continuous transit bond, the government treats it as a severe national security threat. The trucks are instantly seized, the drivers are detained for questioning, and the cargo is frozen in place until a massive penalty is paid and a new compliance officer is authorized. My phone rang again. This time I recognized the number. It was Lance's direct cell line. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered. I kept my voice completely relaxed as I said hello. Lance was screaming so loudly the audio was clipping. There was pure, unadulterated terror in his voice. He demanded to know what I had done, screaming that the entire fleet was seized. 400 trucks were locked down. The hospital network was threatening to cancel their contract. And the Environmental Protection Agency was on the other line, demanding an explanation. I smoothly told him to calm down, stating I did not know why he was calling me since my position was eliminated and I was no longer an employee. I reminded him. He said my methods were archaic and he owed me nothing. He shrieked, telling me not to play games, saying the federal agents were claiming their bond was invalid and registered to grant compliance. He demanded the login or threatened to sue me for everything I had. I took another sip of my coffee and suggested he ask his expensive lawyer to actually read the corporate archives. I explained that Grant Compliance was my personal company, which I owned entirely, and that when he fired me, he fired the company's legal right to operate. I told him I simply notified the government that I was no longer overseeing his highly questionable, corner-cutting operations. There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears in his head grinding to a halt as the reality of the situation crushed him. He had not just fired an employee. He had fired the legal foundation of his entire operation. He stammered that I could not do that, crying about the $90 million acquisition and how the buyers were arriving tomorrow for the final audit. He said if the fleet was impounded, the deal was dead, and the company would go bankrupt in a month from the late delivery penalties alone. I replied that it sounded like a significant management failure and suggested he consult his automated routing software for a solution. He begged me, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by pathetic whining. He asked how to fix it and offered to rehire me and give me my salary back. I reminded him he fired me for cause, stripped my severance, and tried to steal my $5 million bonus. I told him he did not have the authority to rehire me because I was never working for him again. When he screamed asking what I wanted, I coldly told him I would only speak to the board of directors and told him to have them call me with their checkbook ready. I hung up and blocked his number. Less than 20 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled into my driveway. Donovan stepped out looking like he had aged 10 years over the weekend. He was clutching a thick leather briefcase, looking absolutely terrified. The shark had finally realized he was swimming in a pool of acid. I walked out to the porch and told him he had exactly 5 minutes. Sweating through his expensive suit, Donovan explained, the board was in an emergency session. The buyers were threatening to pull their offer, and they were looking at a catastrophic loss. He offered full reinstatement, my salary, and a public apology. I looked at him with absolute disgust, explaining I did not want a job. I wanted what was legally mine. I laid out my terms. My full $5 million performance bonus, wired immediately, the $250,000 severance package, an emergency reinstatement fee for grant compliance of $1,500,000, a total of $6,750,000, non-negotiable. He swallowed hard, saying the board would have to drain their emergency liquidity reserves. I told him that was their problem, but my final condition was the most important. I demanded the board of directors terminate Lance Caldwell for cause, specifically a severe breach of fiduciary duty. He had to forfeit all bonuses, lose his shares, and be escorted out by security. The lawyer was shocked, but I gave him the choice: fire the arrogant son and save the $90 million deal, or keep him and face bankruptcy. Donovan sprinted to his car, made a frantic phone call, and emerged 10 minutes later, completely pale. He handed me a digital tablet, whispering that the board had agreed to all terms, the wire transfers had been initiated, and Lance was currently being escorted off the premises by building security. I read the ironclad agreement, signed it, and filed the emergency reinstatement paperwork. By noon, the $6,750,000 cleared my bank account. Lance was permanently blacklisted from the logistics sector, going from a smug vice president to a disgraced pariah in just days. As for me, I retired to a beautiful cabin on a lake surrounded by peace, quiet, and a very heavily padded bank account. Sometimes the best revenge is just knowing your true value and letting an arrogant fool cut his own safety net.